Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. We've been talking over the last several weeks about how to apply a template of attributes or of principles or disciplines that first responders use so that we can be in the world yet not of the world. This is something that's important to all of us as Christians as well, right? So could we transfer some of those ideas? And we've been taking this material from Forensic Faith, which is also, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, a curriculum that you can get to use with your small group, or it's just the book you can read for yourself. So the idea here is, how do we take these four things that first responders do, which is accepting duty and getting involved in training, learning how to investigate claims, and now we're going to talk about how to communicate those claims to others. Because let's face it, in the end, most of us as Christians understand that we have been called to communicate the gospel to others, to make the claim to others. Now, of course, this is why I say, if you don't know what your duty is, if you haven't embraced your duty as somebody who should know enough about theological principles, about the history of Christianity, about the apologetics, enough to be able to make the case for why this is true in case somebody says, well, I disagree with you. If you haven't accepted that duty and you haven't trained and learned how to investigate these claims, then it's going to be much more difficult for you to communicate these claims to others. And this is why we do all of this. If nothing else, the Great Commission alone should activate everything else. This is the fourth element that I talk about in Forensic Faith, but really it's the tail that wags the dog, right? Because it's my desire to communicate the gospel that requires me to do all the other things, to accept my duty, to train, to learn how to investigate, so that when I finally run up against somebody who maybe doesn't agree or has got an objection, or just has an honest question, just wants to know, well, if that's true, then what about this? We need to be ready to be able to answer those kinds of questions. I've said it before, we don't need another $1 million apologist. And by the way, I don't care how many books you have on your bookshelf, and how many books you think are a great resource, that you think, hey, we should give those books to if you got a question, I'll give you a book. Well, good luck with that, because most of the time your friends will not read that book. They just asked you the question. They want you to answer it. So we have to accept that responsibility. We can't find the best apologetics book you think you've ever seen and give it to your friends. You need to be the best apologist that you can be, the best Christian case maker that you can be, so that you can share that with people firsthand. They want to hear your voice. They want to hear it said in a way that where maybe your relationship helps you to frame how you say it. Maybe you know that person and where they're coming from better than anyone else, and you know you can speak at a certain level, or maybe not that level, or maybe speak in a certain framework or not in that framework. You know the people who are asking you these questions better than anyone else. So you can't just give them a generic book necessarily. Now, what I would suggest is we have to be reading all those books so that we can be equipped. This is part of accepting our duty, training, and learning how to investigate. Now, that being said, I want to turn a corner now and talk about how we communicate this to others. Now, a lot of what I talk about in Forensic Faith comes as a result of years I've spent making the case for a case in criminal trials in front of juries. You sure learn a lot. And as a matter of fact, we often will debrief the jury afterwards. I was just at a police convention where I was talking to a district attorney about a cold case he had just worked. And unfortunately, he wasn't able to debrief his jury as much as he would have liked afterwards. Now, he won the case, but just because you won doesn't mean you can't learn something. As a matter of fact, you need to talk to your jury to say, hey, what was strong? What was weak? What was the piece of evidence you felt to be most compelling? What did we do? You learn about communicating from talking to those who you just spent 6 weeks to 3 months communicating to. You can learn a lot from debriefing your jury afterwards. We've done that a number of times. It's one of the funnest things, I think, because now finally you get to relax and you can actually talk about all kinds of things, not just the content of the message and the evidence you've been delivering over those weeks, but also your own demeanor, and they can tell you what they thought of you, which is sometimes eye-opening. So my point here is that we can learn something from that process. Now, let me just begin by when I'm asked to teach evangelism, And that has happened a number of times, either for high school camps or for adult conferences. And sometimes we think, well, it's going to be about a series of principles or a strategy, or first do this, then do that. And sometimes the most important thing I'm going to say seems like it's a little disappointing to some people, because it's not going to be a process that I'm going to encourage you to start, or it's not going to be a set of steps I'm going to ask you to take. Instead, it's going to be a way of thinking that's foundational to everything else. And it comes from my own experience when people ask me this question. This is from Forensic Faith, the book. They'll often ask, Jim, where is it that you win your cases? Is it in opening statement? Is it in evidence presentation? Is it in the closing argument? Is it in jury deliberation? And I have to tell them, sadly, that it's not in any of those where we really do our work and where really the case is made or broken. It is in jury selection. That's right. It's in jury selection. Now, sometimes people don't think about how important it is to select a jury. They're really thinking about what I need to say or what I need to do. They're not thinking about stepping back a step and first considering who are you about to say it or do it in front of. But jury selection is key. Sadly, if you pick the wrong jury, by the way, did you realize we can pick a jury? Some people don't even realize that. They have never been part of a jury process. They don't realize that we get a bunch of jurists who are brought to us, and we're going to pick 12 in the box and maybe 4 alternates if it's a long case. So we're going to take 16 out of a room of 70 or so. And those jurors are going to come in, and we're going to get a number. It depends on the state. But each state allows prosecutors and defense attorneys to exclude certain jurors that they don't want on the jury. And they discover they don't want them by asking questions in what's called a voir dire process. And also there are many times in bigger cases, like on ones I've worked, where we were actually able to create a survey, a questionnaire that we can give jurors, and we can say, hey, fill out this survey, this questionnaire, and we can learn so much about, we're then able to kind of rate them where we want them, and then we do our best to eliminate those that we don't think will give us a fair shake. And the defense does the same thing. Did you realize that? So it's not as though it's just the prosecutor. We're not trying to game the system, but we are trying to eliminate people who are not willing to put their biases on the shelf. Now, I say this all the time, that every juror who comes in and everyone you talk to has got a bias, including you and me. We've got, let's put it this way, we've got beliefs and worldviews that shape the way we see things. And we might even hold biases that could be dangerous in a jury trial. And so we know we can't find people without biases, but we will ask people, are you willing, once we've identified what these biases are, or what we think they might be, are you willing to suspend that bias long enough to do a fair job in this trial? And look, some people can do that, and they'll tell you that, and some people can't, and they'll tell you that too. So it is about us trying to figure out, do we have people who can suspend their bias? And then we start to select the jury. I want to help you select a good jury as well. And so you will have a good opportunity, a good chance of communicating what you already know to be true. Because even though you may have all the skills down, you may have all the information correct, you might be a wonderful communicator, you might have a heart of gold. If you haven't selected your jury carefully, it's not going to be effective. The first and foremost thing you must do is select a good jury. We'll come back right after the break and we'll talk about how to do that.
Be sure to visit the Cold Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold Case Christianity podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case note email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay. So how do we select a good jury? What are the basic attributes of good jurors? Well, I'm looking for 3 things personally, and I always put it this way when I'm looking for jurors, because these 3 things will help me to select people who will, even though they may not know much about my case, and that's good actually, I don't need knowledge to be one of the things you have to. You have to have a PhD in some area in order to do a good job. I'm looking for 3 things you may not expect. 1, I'm looking for passion. I want passionate jurors who are willing to see how important this is, and who are willing to do a good job, and they aren't apathetic. They are instead, they get how important their role is in the system, and they are passionate about helping. 2, I'm looking for people who are unbiased, because if you have an unfair bias, you're not going to do anybody any good. And 3, I'm looking for people who are humble. Because that's why a lot of times I will not put people in who maybe have a level of expertise related to my case. If I've got some case where, let's say, an arson was committed, a fire was developed in order to kill somebody, and if you've got, and maybe it's an electrical fire, and then you're an electrician, I'm probably not going to put you on my jury if I'm going to call electrical experts, because sometimes you having some expertise, and if your pride gets in the way, if you're not a humble person, if you're too proud, you may not want to listen to the advice or the expertise of anyone else because you think you know better. Look, we have to at least evaluate that potential in people. Passion, unbiased, and humble. That's what I'm looking for. Now, let's just talk about the spectrum that I see in every jury pool. So we get a bunch of people in that room. We're only going to select 16. Well, how do we know what are we trying to eliminate? We know there's a spectrum of bias, and I'll put it on the screen for you. From Forensic Faith, this is the bias spectrum that I typically see when selecting a jury. Half the room, some percentage of the room will have people in it who are largely supportive of the prosecution team. And the other side of the room, there'll be people there who are less supportive or are more supportive of the defense team. It's just the nature of how things are, especially in the culture in which we live today. You're going to have people who have had a good experience with law enforcement who would be largely supportive of anything the prosecutor or the police officers offer. And on the other side, you have people who have had a bad experience with law enforcement. I get it. And they may not want to believe anything that law enforcement or the prosecutor has to say. Well, these two large groups that are in that room, they can be divided into 2 subsets. Let's take a look at that from Forensic Faith. You have, in group number 1, people who are so committed to the prosecution team and to law enforcement that we could say or do almost anything and they will convict this poor guy. I mean, they might not even be fair because they're so biased and so committed toward the prosecution. And in group 2, you have people who are, largely trust the prosecution and they would lean toward the prosecution perhaps, but they are fair. They're open-minded. They will do the right thing. They have a sense of honor and duty. And if there's not enough evidence there, they're not going to convict. Now in group 3, you have people who are inclined toward the defense, but they are also fair and open-minded. And if there is enough evidence to convict, they might even do it reluctantly, but they will do it because they know their duty. And then in group 4, you have people who are so committed to the defense team or so opposed to law enforcement in general or the prosecution that even if we had the greatest slam dunk case in the world, they are not going to convict this guy or gal because they are committed to the defense's side of the room. So there you have the spectrum we talked about, right? That spectrum from 1 to 4. And of course, what are we trying to do as both prosecutors and defense teams? We are trying to eliminate the edges. That's right. We are looking for people in groups 2 or 3. As a matter of fact, I'm putting this on the screen here so you can see that this is what we're trying to do in every jury selection. We are trying to just get the people who are 2s and 3s, maybe inclined one way or the other, but they are fair, they understand their duty, they will do the right thing. Now, why do I bring this up? Because something very similar happens when it comes to picking a jury to share the gospel. Now, that you might think, well, do I really have to treat it that sterilely, like picking a juror? Well, I think that when I see jurors come in the room, and after we interview them on the stand, and both sides hear what they have to say, and we even do surveys, and so we can see questionnaires, and both sides will get those questionnaires so they can see how they responded. At some point, we are able to see where on the spectrum each person is sitting. And that helps us we're not looking to, like I said, not to game the system. Of course, I think both sides, if they could game the system, they probably would, but each side will keep the other from doing that, okay? So in the end, what we're looking to do here is to simply set it up in such a way that people who are fair. And the truth will actually prevail. And it won't be someone's stubbornness or someone's bad experience we didn't uncover with law enforcement or with some person who looks like our defendant or whatever that causes the jury to hang or causes the jury to convict or whatever it may be. We want people to be fair. And so what we're looking for is to eliminate the edges. Now, I'm going to take a break. When I come back, I want to show you how this applies to selecting who you're going to share the gospel with. Because in the end, you know people who are in the same spectrum. And figuring out where they are in the spectrum will help determine how you share the gospel. Why do you think we picked the gospels we picked? Look at Acts chapter 1. We're replacing Judas, right? Everyone's in the upper room. And they're saying, okay, we need someone to take Judas's place. So, okay, what are the qualifications going to be for the people who will be called disciples, the apostles, who will actually share the message? Who's going to take the 12th position? It's got to be somebody who saw Jesus and knew Jesus from the baptism all the way through the resurrection. In other words, we're looking for an eyewitness. If you're not an eyewitness, you can't be part of that 12. The same thing is true with the Gospels. The books we have in our Scripture, the first most important criteria is, were they written by people who were really there as eyewitnesses? So we have 4 Gospels. Now, well, how about Luke, though? Luke wasn't there as an eyewitness, and he tells you that. He was with Paul, but he had access to the eyewitnesses on a first-hand basis, and he says that in the first chapter of his book. Okay. Now let's talk about how this applies to selecting a jury for your efforts to share the gospel. And I think I know people in all these categories. Again, let's go back to our continuum, our bias, or in this case I'm going to say our openness continuum, how people are open. How open are they to hearing the gospel at all? Well, I think you could divide the entire world. Again, this is a photograph from Forensic Faith, or an image from Forensic Faith, a graphic that I drew for it. You can divide the entire potential hearers of your statements about the gospel into 2 groups. People who are receptive because they're already believers, and people who are not because they're non-believers, or they have some less level of receptivity because they are not believers to begin with. So this is how we start. Again, just like in jury selection, 2 kinds of people are sitting in the jury. Just like in that situation, you have a similar situation in sharing the gospel in your world, wherever you may be, your workplace, your school, wherever it is you're talking. You've got 2 groups who are listening, potentially people who are believers and people who aren't. And you might think, well, look, what do we even share with believers? Well, yeah, sadly, because just because you say you're a believer does not mean you even know what the gospel is. Let me just be clear about that. It's sad enough that every year the number of people who call themselves Christians is shrinking by 1%, as the number of people who say they have no religious affiliation at all is growing by 1%. But what's even more dramatic, it seems to me, is that when you survey the people who are left in the group called Christians, they still claim to be Christians, and you ask them, and Barna has done this in the last couple of years, just basic questions about Christian theology and worldview. What does it even mean to be a Christian? What do we think? Who do we think Jesus was? What do we think the nature of God is? What do we think the nature of salvation is? You'll be sad to find that a very small percentage of people who call themselves Christians actually hold a Christian worldview, or could accurately define the tenets, the basic doctrines, the basic core beliefs of Christianity. So sometimes we are speaking to groups that we might say, well, they're Christians, but they may be somebody we still want to share the gospel with. Does that sound crazy? But you know it's true, because you probably have friends who would call themselves Christians, don't even know what the gospel is, and couldn't articulate it. So we have this spectrum again, 2 halves. Now let's do the same thing we did in the last situation with the jury. Let's divide up each group again into 2 subsets. And here's the illustration from Forensic Faith. I was going to say Cold Case Christianity, it's from Forensic Faith. Again, group number 1. These are people who would say they're believers, and they're so committed to their Christian beliefs that they think, I don't even need it. You don't need to make the case for me, Jim. You don't even need to say anything about it. I'm already a believer. Just time out, I'm already a believer. As a matter of fact, they're so committed as believers that even if it was demonstrably false, even if we had the body of Jesus, then we could somehow authenticate it. Could you imagine? But the point is, if we had the body of Jesus and we're dragging it around in front of them, they would still say, I don't care. I don't care if you could prove it's false. I know for me, I've had a powerful experience, and it works for me, and my family was this way ever since I was a kid, and I've been raised this way, and I am not going to change my mind on this. And so for these folks, they will say they're in, and they don't care whether or not you could prove it or disprove it, or whether there's even proof otherwise. Now, in group 2, you have people who would say, well, yeah, I'm a Christian, but man, I got some questions. And there's days when I feel like I don't even know if this is true, and I've got my doubts kind of rise or fall, and I've had ups and downs. I still say I'm a Christian, but man, I've got lots of doubts. And then you have people in group 3. These are people who are not Christians, but they would also say that they have lots of open questions about their secular worldview, or their naturalistic explanations for the universe, or they just have some doubts. They've seen some things that make them sometimes think maybe there is a God. And then you have group fours. These are people who are not only non-believers, not only atheists, but they are anti-theists. They don't even like the idea that you would pose the existence of a God. And if they're like the Richard Dawkins of the world, who says God is not good. If there is a God, he's not good, based on what we see in the world around us. These are people who do not want God to exist, not only don't believe he exists, they are anti-theists. These are the people who, when I do a presentation in a college across anywhere in the United States, and some atheist group comes out and they're in the back row, they are mocking me and live tweeting or posting on social media profanity, because they aren't just passive non-believers. These are people who are aggressive non-believers. This is the kind of the new atheist movement we saw several years ago. Okay, now that being said, you now have that spectrum divided again into 4 groups, 1 through 4. Do you remember how last time we were talking about selecting a jury, how the defense attorneys and the prosecutors are trying to eliminate the edges, just get 2s and 3s? Well, what I've noticed with sharing your faith with people about Christianity is that this group of 4, I call this the 3-quarter principle. Anytime I'm talking about Jesus or trying to explain the Christian worldview or offering the gospel, I know of those 4 groups, only 3 are paying attention. So here's the diagram from Forensic Faith again. These are the 3 who will give me a fair hearing. Group of 4 is not going to give you a fair hearing. Just not going to happen. They are so opposed that they are going to basically block anything you have to say, or constantly criticize you, and you've seen it, right? You have seen people in group 4 who are on your social media. When you say anything about God, they'll want to say, well, God should be removed from the public setting. I mean, these are people who are really adamantly against God existing. And you probably have had those kinds of discussions in social media with them, or you've seen their comments on blog posts or your favorite blog or whatever. So you know they're out there. They may even be in your own family. I have them in my family. I was that guy in group 4 for a number of years. So I would suggest that once I know what kind of jurors I have seated, I have a strategy about how to make the case to them. Same thing happens here. I know that with group 1s, they might say, well, Jim, you don't need to make the case for me. I don't need it. I'm already in. I'm glad it's true. I'm glad you can make the case and prove that it's true. I don't care, though. I'm not interested in making the case. Really? I still share the case, evidentially, with number 1s. And you might think, what's the point? Well, because they're in a family, I would suggest, where their own kids, if they're my age or younger, are in group 2. And it's young people, from the time they're about in junior high, who start to move from group 1s, they just believe what their parents said, into group 2s where they're starting to have doubts. And by the way, they're always looking to group 1s to get answers. They're looking to people in their own family, their own parents, who may be utterly convinced this is true and don't need the evidence for themselves. But if they don't master the evidence, they won't be able to answer the questions for their kids. You, if you're in group 1, have a duty to hear the evidence for Christianity and to master it along with all the other groups, because you've got kids probably who are in group 2, if not in group 3. Of course, we want to reach people in group 2 and 3, and we need to master the evidence so we can answer their questions, respond to their objections. We have terrible things happening in the country all around us, between mass shootings and natural disasters, and people like this in group 2s and 3, they want to know how to make sense of that, and how could there be a loving God and all that nasty stuff happen anyway. And we have to be able to master the case for what we believe for groups 2 and 3. Now, what about group 4? This is a tough group, right? And there is a passage of Scripture in which Jesus says we are not to be casting our pearls to swine. And I always think, God, it's such a harsh statement. I don't know, how would I even judge who's swine, right? I hate to even call anybody that. But what I think he's talking about here is there are times when you are not, there's no point in it, because these folks are, now look, I'm this kind of person who, even though I might rationally identify somebody in group 4, I'm still going to make the case. But I'm going to do it in a different way, right? I've got people in my own family who I love desperately who are in group 4. And I'm going to gently offer what I believe. And when they push back aggressively, I'm not going to get into a headbutting match with these folks. There is a specific strategy that I use for everyone in group 4. And I'm going to offer it to you because I think that for the most part, you probably know somebody in Group 4. Group 4s, you pray and you model Christ. You pray for Group 4s, anyone you know in Group 4, and you continue to model the character and patience of Jesus to people in Group 4. Now, I will still offer when I can, make little statements, try to put a stone in someone's shoe. But I'm not going to, consistently think that I'm going to have to say the same rote talk over and over again to these folks because it's just going to irritate them. Instead, I'm going to pray and model Christ, and it may take a long time because modeling takes a long time. And if you do that, God may move that Group 4 person into Group 3, and then every conversation you'll have. Every conversation you've had for years going back will come back to mind for that person who's now in Group 3. And because Group 3s are people who God has removed the enmity that they had toward God. That's where they find themselves in Group 3. That was my personal story. I used to think I was crazy that I was now listening to people and reading about Jesus and examining the evidence. I never would have done that. If you'd have met me at the age of 34, you'd have said, Jim's never going to do that. Yet here I was at 35, actually examining the evidence for Christianity. How did I move from Group 4 to Group 3? I'm telling you, I think somebody prayed me into that. Or God just decided on his own sovereignty to move me from 4 to 3. And then the means by which the gospel was communicated to me was through evidence, which is not unusual in the history of Christianity, as you know from prior episodes here at Cold Case Christianity. And then I was able to hear clearly and had a passion to actually examine further the case for Christianity because God responded to prayer and I was moved from Group 4 to Group 3. So when you're getting frustrated that you've got somebody who's antagonistic and is treating you horribly, that happens to me all the time. I'm like, I'm over it. I expect that. He's in Group 4. That's what Group 4s do. Don't be a knucklehead. Get over it. Model. Pray. Don't worry, God will act. And when he's in Group 3, you'll be able to reach that person. Don't get discouraged while that person's in Group 4. Expect Group 4s to act like Group 4s. That's what they do. That being said, I hope that kind of helps you as you begin. Now, we'll be talking in the next few episodes about how we communicate the gospel, but I want to start with jury selection. And that's what we started with this first approach. Picking the right jury is the key. Talk to you next week here at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.